Welcome to another deep dive. Today, um, we're going to be tackling something I think we all deal with every day.
Yeah.
Workplace communication,
Oh, yeah.
especially between men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And, you sent over some audio excerpts from Deborah Tannen's Talking from 9 to 5.
Yeah.
So
Great book.
let's extract some golden nuggets about how conversational styles, really affect those office relationships.
Yeah, it's amazing how Tannen uses real stories to show that, these aren't just theories. They're
Yeah.
playing out, right now.
Yeah.
In meetings and break rooms, everywhere.
Okay, so let's start with this idea.
Okay.
Can hierarchy and connection coexist?
Hmm.
Tannen contrasts American and Japanese workplace cultures,
Right.
which is fascinating.
Yeah, the book points out that Americans tend to view hierarchy as distancing.
Okay.
The assumption is that, bosses and employees can't be genuine friends without, complications.
It's like we think authority means you have to keep everyone at arm's length.
Yeah, yeah.
But then Tannen introduces the Japanese perspective,
Yeah.
where hierarchy can actually strengthen relationships.
Right. She uses the example of the mother-child dynamic in Japanese workplaces, where there's clear hierarchy,
Right.
but also closeness and interdependence.
Yeah.
It makes you rethink whether those two things have to be at odds.
I've definitely worked in places where it felt like any connection with higher-ups was frowned upon.
Right.
Have you experienced that kind of strict separation?
Oh, absolutely. Early in my career, there was this unspoken rule that socializing with management was a no-go.
Yeah.
It definitely created a them versus us feeling.
So Tannen then delves into self-lowering,
Yes.
where people might downplay their status for strategic benefits.
Yes, it's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
She uses examples like the Wolof people of Africa,
Okay.
where a noble might actually try to appear lower in status to encourage generosity from others.
Wow.
It really challenges our assumptions about how hierarchy operates.
That makes me think, have you ever felt the need to downplay your expertise or accomplishments to fit in?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe soften your language or avoid taking credit?
Definitely, especially earlier in my career.
Yeah.
I sometimes hesitated to speak up too forcefully or assert my knowledge, worried it would be perceived negatively.
It makes you wonder what the cost of that self-lowering is,
Right.
both for the individual and the organization.
Yeah.
Are we missing out on valuable contributions because people feel the need to shrink themselves?
That's a crucial question, and it highlights how important it is for workplaces to foster a culture where everyone feels safe to contribute their full potential without resorting to those kinds of strategic maneuvers.
Now let's talk about something seemingly positive,
Okay.
compliments.
Mm-hmm.
But as Cannon points out,
Yeah.
even compliments can be tricky in the workplace.
Right. She highlights research showing that compliments tend to flow downward in a hierarchy.
Oh,
The very act of complimenting someone can reinforce the power structure.
that never occurred to me before. The book shares a story where an American woman compliments her Indian mother-in-law as Saras, and it totally backfires.
That's a perfect example of how cultural differences add another layer of complexity.
Right.
In some cultures, a compliment might be misinterpreted as judgment envy or even a demand.
Right.
It really highlights the need to be culturally sensitive and aware of how our words might be received.
That story makes me wonder, have you ever received a compliment that felt more complicated than just praise?
Oh, absolutely. Early in my career, I remember a senior colleague complimenting my youthful enthusiasm.
Uh-huh.
On the surface, it seemed positive,
Right.
but it also felt like a subtle way of reminding me of my junior status.
It's amazing how much meaning can be packed into seemingly simple words.
Yeah.
Even something as casual as small talk isn't immune to those power dynamics.
You're right. The book observes that even when to shift from work talk to social talk can be dictated by hierarchy.
Okay.
In one example, in police helicopter crews,
Yeah.
it was almost always the pilot, the highest-ranking person who initiated that shift.
So it's like, who controls the on and off switch
Yeah.
for casual conversation
Yeah.
becomes a subtle way of asserting authority. I've definitely experienced that. It's
Yeah.
amazing how much impact those subtle cues can have.
Absolutely. Tannen also contrasts boy talk, which can be quite blunt and jokey,
Yep.
with girl talk, which often involves more compliments and affirmations.
So to clarify, boy talk isn't necessarily limited to men, and girl talk isn't limited to women.
Right.
It's more about those different styles of communication and how they play out in the workplace.
Exactly. Both types of small talk build rapport, but they do it in very different ways.
Thinking about your own workplace, what kind of small talk do you observe?
Mm-hmm.
Does it help build genuine connections, or does it subtly reinforce power dynamics?
Yeah.
Maybe even create new ones?
Yeah, it's fascinating to observe those patterns, isn't it? Now, this leads us to an area ripe for miscommunication.
Okay.
Complaining. How do complaints function in a workplace hierarchy?
Yeah, it feels like the potential for things to go wrong really ramps up here. The book tells this story about a fire chief who felt obligated to act on an employee's complaint, even though she was just venting and didn't actually want him to do anything about it.
That perfectly illustrates how the intent behind a complaint can be easily missed, especially across different levels of authority.
Right.
What one person considers casual venting can sound like a formal grievance to someone in a different position.
It's a reminder to be really mindful of who we're talking to,
Right.
that what might fly with a peer could land very differently with a boss.
Absolutely. Tannen then gives another example, a conversation between a newspaper editor and a young writer. The writer makes casual complaints about his computer, but the editor takes it as serious criticism of his leadership.
Ouch, that's gotta sting. But the book mentions that this situation is actually diffused using humor.
Yes, it highlights how humor can be a really valuable tool for recalibrating those conversations when things start going sideways. Have you ever used humor to smooth things over in a tense situation at work?
Oh, totally. It's like having this release valve when things get too serious. I once accidentally replied all to an email with a sarcastic comment about a new policy, and I thought I was going to get fired. But I quickly sent another reply all with a self-deprecating joke, and thankfully everyone found it funny. It totally diffused the tension.
That's a brilliant example. It shows how a well-placed joke can completely change the tone and the outcome of a conversation.
So going back to complaints, how do you navigate them in your workplace? How do you ensure that your intentions are understood, whether you're the one complaining or the one on the receiving end, especially when there's that power dynamic involved?
That's such an important question. For me, clarity is key. If I'm venting, I make it super explicit that I'm just letting off steam and not looking for action. And when I'm listening to a complaint, I try to really tune into the subtext. Is this a problem they want help solving, or do they just need to be heard?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Being able to read those cues and respond accordingly can make all the difference.
Now let's tackle a topic that often sparks debate: interruptions. Tannen challenges the common assumption that men interrupt more than women.
Yes. She presents research showing that all male groups can actually have more interruptions than mixed gender groups.
It's not simply about the number of interruptions, but the function they serve. Is it a cooperative interruption adding to the conversation, or a dominating one shutting someone down?
There's this powerful example in the book about a student group where the male students constantly interrupted the only female student, preventing her from making her point. It's like they saw her contributions as a threat and used interruptions to maintain control.
It's a perfect illustration of how interruptions can be used to silence dissenting voices, particularly those of women. It's a reminder to be very conscious of how we use interruptions and the impact they might have on others. Thinking back on your own experiences, do you perceive interruptions differently based on the gender of the speakers?
It's funny you ask that because I've definitely noticed that I tend to react differently to interruptions from men versus women. Interruptions from men sometimes feel more aggressive, while interruptions from women often feel more collaborative. But I wonder how much of that is my own bias based on those stereotypes we've been talking about.
That's a really insightful observation, and it highlights how deeply ingrained these perceptions can be. It's a reminder to constantly challenge our own assumptions and biases to make sure we're creating a truly inclusive and equitable communication environment.
Okay, let's move on to another workplace staple: meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've all felt unheard or overlooked in a meeting at some point. But Tannen offers some fascinating insights into why that happens.
She tells the story about Cheryl, who participates in a focus group and leaves feeling really good about her contributions. But when Tannen analyzes the transcript later, she realizes that most of the key ideas that were actually implemented came from Cheryl. The problem is those ideas have been amplified and elaborated on by a male colleague named Phil, who held a higher rank.
That's so frustrating. It's like Cheryl's ideas needed that male voice to give them weight and legitimacy.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that both Cheryl and Phil felt positive about the interaction. But if that dynamic continues, it could have a real impact on their careers. Cheryl might be overlooked for promotions, while Phil gets credit for ideas that weren't originally his.
It makes you wonder if Phil even realized what was happening. Was he intentionally taking credit, or was it more unconscious?
That's a great question. And I think it highlights how these power dynamics can operate on a very subtle level, even when there's no malicious intent. It's a reminder to be constantly checking ourselves and making sure we're not unintentionally contributing to those inequities.
So if you're finding yourself struggling to get your voice heard in meetings, what can you do Tannen offers some really practical advice here.
One suggestion is to be mindful of the language we use. For example, women often use self-protective openers like, I don't know if this will work, but, or you've probably already thought of this, but.
It's like we're apologizing for having an opinion. No wonder our ideas don't land with as much impact.
Right. Those qualifiers can undermine the power of our contributions. Tannen also emphasizes the importance of projecting confidence, even if we don't always feel it.
It's that fake it till you make it idea, right?
Exactly. But it's important to acknowledge that this can be a lot harder for women who are often socialized to be more deferential and less assertive, especially in professional settings.
So there's this tricky balancing act between asserting ourselves and adhering to those gendered expectations that can sometimes work against us. It's like we're damned if we do, damned if we don't.
It is a tricky balance, and it's frustrating that those double standards still exist. But by becoming more aware of them, we can start to challenge them and create a more equitable playing field.
Tannen also challenges the assumption that quieter individuals are less influential. She uses the example of Garrett, a British employee who was relatively quiet in meetings but held a lot of sway within the group.
What's interesting about Garrett is that he didn't change his communication style to fit in with the more dominant American style. His colleagues respected his expertise and insights, even though he expressed them in a more understated way.
It's a reminder that there's no one right way to communicate.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's about finding the style that feels most authentic to you and trusting that your contributions will be valued.
Absolutely. And it's also about leaders creating a space where everyone feels comfortable contributing, regardless of their communication style. This might involve directly soliciting input from quieter individuals or structuring meetings in a way that ensures everyone has an opportunity to speak.
It's about recognizing that diversity communication styles can actually be a strength if we're willing to create an environment where everyone feels empowered to participate. Now, Tannen also explores how the structure of meetings can impact participation, and this is where it gets really interesting.
She discusses research on student writing groups where women participated equally in structured settings but spoke less and were interrupted more when the groups were unstructured.
So those unstructured meetings, which are often intended to be more democratic and inclusive, can actually end up having the opposite effect.
Exactly. They can create an environment where those who are more comfortable with self-promotion and less inclined to yield the floor end up dominating the conversation, often at the expense of women and those from less assertive cultures.
So what can we do to create more inclusive and productive meetings? Tannen offers some valuable suggestions here.
One key takeaway is that leaders need to be more mindful of those subtle communication dynamics we've been discussing, noticing if certain individuals are consistently being interrupted or if their ideas are being overlooked.
And it's not just about being observant. It's about actively intervening to create a more balanced and equitable discussion.
Right. This could involve directly soliciting input from quieter individuals, setting ground rules for how interruptions will be handled, or using a round-robin format to ensure everyone has equal speaking time.
Those are all fantastic strategies. I especially love the idea of a round-robin format because it levels the playing field and prevents anyone from dominating the conversation.
It's a simple but effective way to create a more structured and inclusive environment. And it's about recognizing that sometimes the best ideas might come from unexpected sources. And those sources might need a little extra encouragement or support to feel comfortable sharing their perspectives.
That's a really important point.
Okay.
It's not always the loudest voices that have the best ideas.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about how gender and cultural differences can impact our experiences in meetings. Tannen provides a really insightful example from a law review board meeting.
Oh, yes. This one really stuck with me. The female members of the board were strongly advocating for publishing an article about women in law school, but the male members were completely opposed to it.
And what's interesting is that it wasn't necessarily that the men disagreed with the article's content.
Right. It wasn't about the substance.
It was more about their approach to decision-making. They were operating from this like win-lose mentality,
Okay.
where any concession felt like a defeat.
Whereas the women were more focused on consensus and keeping things harmonious. And that actually ended up silencing them, even though they had strong arguments.
Yeah, and I imagine this kind of dynamic plays out in all sorts of workplaces.
Oh, yeah.
Editorial meetings, strategy sessions, you name it.
Tannen brings up the work of Nancy Woodhull,
Yes.
a consultant who helps newspapers appeal to more female readers.
Right, and Woodhull noticed that even when newspapers have women in editor roles,
Okay.
they often struggle to get their story ideas through.
So like just having women on staff isn't enough if the decision-making processes themselves are still favoring that more traditionally masculine style.
Yeah.
And then it's not just gender. Of course, cultural differences come into play too.
Right.
The book talks about how Japanese communication often prioritizes harmony and being indirect,
Right.
which can be great in many settings,
Yeah.
but maybe not when you're trying to get your point across in a fast-paced meeting.
Exactly. It highlights how there's no universal right way to communicate.
Yeah.
What works in one culture might backfire in another.
So much to think about. Now, there's this other research Tannen talks about that I found really eye-opening. It's about the structure of meetings and how it affects participation. She discusses the work of two researchers, Elizabeth Aries and Sandra Lawrence, who studied student writing groups.
Yeah, and their finding was surprising.
Yep.
In groups with a set structure where everyone had a turn to speak,
Okay.
men and women participated equally.
Interesting.
But in unstructured groups, it was the women who spoke less and got interrupted more.
It's almost counterintuitive, right? You'd think a less structured setting would be more equal, but it seems like it can actually amplify those unconscious biases.
That's right. If you're someone who's naturally more assertive and comfortable speaking up,
Yeah,
an unstructured setting might work in your favor.
right.
But if you're someone who's more hesitant or takes a more collaborative approach, you might end up getting talked over.
So then the question becomes, how do we design meetings that are truly inclusive and give everyone an equal chance to contribute?
Well, a key takeaway from the book is that leaders need to be super attuned to those subtle dynamics we've been talking about. Noticing who's getting interrupted, whose ideas are being dismissed, and making a conscious effort to rebalance the conversation.
It's not enough to just notice it. You have to actually step in and make a change.
That's right. You might need to directly ask quieter folks for their input, set ground rules for interruptions, or even try something like a round-robin format where everyone gets an equal amount of time to speak.
I love that.
Well,
It creates a structure where those who might otherwise dominate the conversation are forced to take a step back and give others a chance.
and ultimately, it's about recognizing that diversity of communication styles can be a real asset.
Exactly. If everyone's approaching things the same way, you're going to miss out on a lot of great ideas.
So to wrap things up, I think this deep dive has really highlighted how much those seemingly small differences in communication style can have a huge impact in the workplace.
It's been so insightful. I feel like I have a whole new awareness of these dynamics and how they might be playing out in my own interactions.
And I think the most important takeaway is that we all have a responsibility to be more mindful and inclusive communicators.
Absolutely. By understanding these dynamics and making a conscious effort to create a more equitable playing field, we can help unlock the full potential of everyone on our teams.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And until next time, remember, communication is key. So let's keep those conversations flowing.